Yellow and Red, mixed by Digits 27, Chapter 5. Naruto stood open mouthed, stared at the girl, partly because of the language she had used, and partly because of what she had said. He broke out of the stupor when she shot him a strange look, and he turned to look into the mirror. Much to his surprise, when he did so, it wasn't what he had expected. The person who looked back at him from the grease-stained glass didn't have his usual vibrant cerulean eyes. Instead, they were a demonic red, and the pupils had transformed into slits that went from top side of the iris to the bottom. The girls kept looking at him strangely. It looked like the kid had never seen his eyes before. The way he was staring at his own face made her raise an eyebrow. The shock on his face was priceless. Naruto, on the other hand, was anything but amused. "Kyubi, what the hell is happening to my eyes?" She heard a hurried groan, and he could picture the startled fox wearily rubbing her eyes. "Oh, have you finally just noticed? Sorry, I guess I forgot to mention it." Naruto continued to stare slack-jawed at his reflection. "What do you mean you forgot? And what is this?" He heard the creature let out a short chuckle, which didn't do anything to calm his slowly growing irritation. "How exactly did you think I altered your sight, Kit? Don't worry, you'll get used to them." She also added with no small amount of mock sensuality. "Plus, I think they look good on you." Naruto was left pretty speechless after that, not quite sure how to process all of this. When it appeared his brain had actually short-circuited, the demon sighed wearily. "If you really hate it that much, then the first jutsu I'll teach you will be the henge. Then you can cover it up all you like." Despite trying to sound nonchalant, a small amount of disappointment managed to creep into the ancient being's voice. She had honestly believed Naruto wouldn't mind all that much. They were just eyes after all, and it was like having his own dojutsu. He had managed to snap himself out of it when he detected the hint of hurt in her voice. However, Naruto, no matter how old, was still useless around women. "It's not that bad. I'd just rather you'd have told me about it sooner." He didn't get a reply, but he did hear a small snore fade away into his subconscious that caused him to grind his teeth. Throughout their entire internal conversation, Naruto had completely forgotten about the red-haired girl who had pointed out his eyes in the first place. Being quite impatient, she quickly reminded this in her own unique way. "Hey, shithead, you still with me?" Naruto turned, startled and a little angered by the annoying. Only just noticing her presence, she had moved closer to him while he had been out of it, and now only stood a foot away from him, watching him curiously. He was again reminded when he looked into her eyes that they reflected his own. There was the same pain and loneliness. He was only 7, but Naruto was well versed in the use of emotional masks and masks to hide one's pain. It was obvious that this girl had taken a different option to Naruto when that choice was thrust upon her. Instead of becoming overly nice and cheerful to win people over, she emitted a defensive wall of fake anger and irritability to drive them away. The most obvious example of this was the language she used. Being from a rather old-fashioned place in that aspect, Naruto wasn't quite used to the insults. Of course, people would call him names, but they were generally more hurtful than vulgar. "What did you call me?" It wasn't said angrily. Now that he at least somewhat knew her situation, he couldn't hold it against her for not trusting him. "What? You got crap in your ears? Want me to spell it out?" Naruto smirked. Her attitude was cold and disguised to push people away. He rationalized that if somebody were to just push through that, they could help her. He didn't know why, but some instinct part of him wanted to be that person. Some maybe some of his mask really had bled into his real personality, as right now he just wanted to help this girl. "Sorry, I guess it's because I didn't tell you my name." He struck out a hand. "Naruto Uzumaki." The girl seemed startled by the response. Usually by now she had people running away from her or looking at her disapprovingly in the case of adults. Instead, this kid ignored her insults completely. It kind of pissed her off. She glared at the hand like it would give her a disease, and made a good show of crossing her arms in response. "No, I called you shithead because you look like someone with shit in their head." He laughed, something that irritated the girl to no end. Just who was this kid, and why could he just shrug her off like this? "Does that mean I can call you Angry Eyes?" The girl was taken aback by his remark. Not only had he completely ignored her attempt at insulting him, but he had answered in kind. She glared at him, and in return his smile broadened. She tried to give him her coldest, most hateful look, and he yawned, exaggerating the movements to show he was unperturbed. "Just who the fuck are you, anyways?" He finished yawning, and his smile returned. "I told you, it's Naruto." She glared at him again. I'm not deaf, shithead. I mean, why are you acting like this? Be nice and shit. Naruto looked at her curiously, then shrugged him. Why shouldn't I be? The casual nature of the reply took the girl by surprise, and in all honesty, she couldn't think of a reply, or at least one that wouldn't make her seem petty. Instead, her mouth just opened and closed like a fish and on dry land. That sight only caused Naruto to break out into laughter, seemingly enraging the fiery-haired girl and breaking her out of her state of shock. What the fuck are you laughing at? Naruto thought it was a silly question and didn't even stop laughing to answer, the words coming out in gasps between laughs. Your face is so funny. Couldn't help it. Like a fish. He couldn't get any more out before she started advancing on him menacingly. However, as soon as she brought a fist back to knock the obvious kind of obnoxious kid right between the eyes, he vanished. She looked around, startled after a while, questioning her sanity for a moment before a voice right behind her shocked her out of her skin. You gotta be quicker than that to Angry Ice. She could feel the smirk radiating off the boy, and she instantly turned, fist ready to finish the punch that had failed, only he wasn't there. Oh, that time was a little closer. This time, the voice was coming from above her, and when she looked up, she saw the kid sitting on one of the rafters in the small room. Stop moving, shithead! He shot her a curious look and tilted his head like a dog who didn't quite understand the master's command. Why would I do that, Angry Eyes? Then you'd hit me? She glared at him, letting out a small, very unladylike growl in his direction. That's the idea, shithead, and stop calling me that. He laughed again, only briefly this time, and dropped to the floor right in front of her. Well, I can't call you your name. You haven't told me yet. I at least told you mine. She leveled a glare at him, but couldn't see the flaw in the kid's logic. Tayuya. He smiled, finally having a name to put with the face. He stuck out his hand again. Nice to meet you, Tayuya. Tayuya gave him exactly the same response as last time, but this time added a huff in for good measure. Naruto may have been acting goofy around her, but by this point he was extremely curious to know what had happened to Tayuya to make her so jaded against the world. He didn't want to ask though. He knew it would be a touchy subject. Hell, if only asked him about his past, he would be saddened as well. Well, anyway, Tayuya, that scary dude with no eyes told me I got to look after you. If he's anything like Conan, then I'm not breaking that promise. She looked at him incredulously when the guy who she knew to be called Nagato had said that she had thought that the kid would just walk straight out of here and never give her a backwards glance. The shock on his face when he had said it immediately told her that it wasn't his idea yet. He was actually going to do it. What the hell? I'm not going running after some shithead that will probably get me killed within a day. Another smile finally dropped. Instead, it replaced with a more neutral, collected expression that seemed out of place after the way he had just acted. Then, where do you plan on going? The question caught her off guard, and without a proper response, she was left with that same open mouth expression she had earlier. This time, Naruto suppressed his chuckle, knowing that it wouldn't do him any good. Well, I need to get going, so if you're coming with me, then we need to go now while it's still dark. Toyo shot him a murderous look with a snarl for effort, and Naruto just shrugged before walking out of the room with his hands in his pockets. Toyo started when she didn't get her desired effect. She watched the boy leave the small room with her feet firmly rooted in place, adamant that she wasn't going to follow some idiot to certain death. After a few moments, though, her mind continued to work, and she realized that with the way he had avoided her punches, as well as the way Nagato had chosen him to protect her, he must have at least some skill. Right now, with no other options and nowhere else to go, this kid was literally her best choice. However, she would be damned if she was going to admit out loud that there was just something about him that intrigued her. Ah, damn it! Wait up, shithead! She ran out of the room, only to nearly trip up as she saw Naruto nonchalantly laying up against the opposite wall of the corridor, grinning at her. She glared at him again and grumbled a few choice words in his direction. Well then, where the hell are we going? Naruto couldn't help but smile a bit when she had said we. It made him feel strange, and he briefly wondered if this was what having a friend left felt like. Sunagakure, the Yuya was a little put off. The village hidden in the sand was an odd destination. Why? She seemed to have struck a chord there as Naruto's grin immediately dropped from his face, and for the first time, the Yuya was allowed a glimpse behind the mask. What she saw was pain, loneliness, suffering, and sadness, all blending together in the boy's eyes. It seemed almost too much for a 7-year-old to have had in his life, but she had seen it for herself. As quickly as it had dropped, the mask sprung back into place, although the smile was small and weaker than before. I had to leave my home. Tayuya didn't press any further. It wasn't that she didn't want to know. In fact, she had actually gotten pretty interested in that small display of emotion. It was the fact that if she started delving into his past, then he might get some funny ideas and start asking his own questions. She just nodded simply, and Naruto turned away, walking out of the building with his new red-haired companion in tow. They had about 2 hours until the sun came up, and Tahia complained the entire time. Naruto just kept walking, tuning out the worst of it. He knew she was only doing it because she wasn't happy with the situation, not because she actually had anything to complain about. He simply talked to QB for a lot of the time, having the usual lesson, only in his head as opposite to his mindscape. The old fox only seemed amused at the news of his new traveling companion and kept making jokes about it during their lesson, to the point where he simply ignored the both of them. That proved especially difficult when one of the people you were trying to ignore was inside your head and the other was only a few feet from you. He gritted his teeth and bore it, knowing that he would at least have sleep to look forward to. Eventually, it was about time to start winding down for the night, and he pulled over into a nearby clearing. He had gotten better at finding them over the week, as he would locate a river or stream and follow it. They eventually found a decent sized space, about 20 feet wide, and a stream large enough that Naruto would wash himself in it. First, though, he went about setting up the usual camp supplies while Tayuya watched his practice motions with barely hidden interest. She had been surviving on her own for a while now, but never in a total wilderness like this before. It was interesting to see the way he prioritized things like getting a fire going before collecting water or to boil. She noticed the distinct lack of a tent and was nearly appalled when he only brought out 2 blankets. He seemed indifferent and threw her the other blanket. It was still late autumn and he knew it would be cold without the second blanket, but he would still survive until they came across another village where he could pick up supplies. He mentally cursed himself all of a sudden. He had been in a village and forgot to pick up the various supplies he needed, but he put it down to the strange events and put it behind him. Hey shithead, do you really expect me to just sleep like a blank with a blanket? He looked at her curiously, wondering if this was a genuine or another false complaint. When he noticed just how cold it was, he realized she was curious. Well, I don't have anything else, but we could share body heat. Tayuya's eyes opened wide at that statement, in no small part because he had said it completely seriously with no hint of a joke. Are you crazy or just fucking stupid? I'm not sleeping with you. Naruto furrowed his brow for a moment, put off slightly by the way she had said it, but just shrugged his shoulders. He offered to help. If she didn't take it, then it wasn't his problem. He figured after a night sleeping in the cold, she would probably take him up on the offer. He was curious about her venomous reaction, though. He didn't see anything wrong with sleeping next to someone if it was just to share heat. Oh, kid, you have so much to learn. That was followed by a great deal of snickering, which only served to confuse Naruto more. He sighed. All of these girls around him seemed to only make his life more complicated. He pulled a rabbit he had saved from yesterday out of his pack and put it in the pot of water to cook. After that, he started making his way over to the river, shedding his clothes as he went. Tayuya had seen him start to cook. The rabbit made her mouth water a little, but she had snapped out of it when she saw the boy begin to undress. What the fuck are you doing? He didn't even slow down to answer, simply calling back over his shoulder. Washing, washing. Otherwise, I have to wake up to the smell of sweat. He stopped, now down to his boxers, which thankfully he seemed to be keeping on. If you don't mind, I'd appreciate you doing the same. Taya looked at him curiously, considering the words until they sunk in. Hey, are you saying I fucking stink? She heard him laughing softly, out of amusement instead of from his supposed insult. No more than anybody else. My nose is sensitive and I'm only just starting to get used to it. Tayuya barely heard the reply, as she was already storming over to him, ready to beat an apology out of him. However, he turned around quickly, shocking her, already beating her to it. Sorry though, it probably came out the wrong way. Tayuya's anger died down a little, but not by much. It was at least nice that he had acknowledged he was in the wrong. Now that her mind wasn't quite as fuzzy with rage, she caught on to something else he had said. What do you mean my nose is sensitive and I'm only just starting to get used to it? He smirked at her, but not in a condescending manner, just out of amusement. He pointed to his eyes slowly. My eyes didn't used to be like this. They only recently changed. It lets me see in the dark better, and sometimes I think I can see farther away, but I might be imagining it. Taya had noticed on their walk that he seemed to have an uncanny knack of seeing where he was going, despite it being so dark. He still didn't see what that had to do with his eyes, but she managed to be patient, crossing her arms and waiting for him to continue. My other senses got heightened as well, smell especially, because it only happened recently. I'm still not used to everything smelling so much stronger, so I have to wash twice or sometimes 3 times a day. So, like I said, if it's okay, then I'd appreciate if you did too. The year was a little put off by the polite and kind way he had asked it. There was no demand or forcefulness, just a request. She wasn't used to this kind of treatment at all, and it was beginning to unnerve her. She grumbled something under her breath, which Naruto heard but didn't make any comment on. It can't be that bad. He grinned again, but this time because he was remembering some funny incident that had arisen the first time he had woken to the strength smell of his own body. It can get really bad. He seemed to think that was a good enough answer and turned. If he put off his washing any longer, then he wouldn't get out with enough time to finish cooking the rabbit. He walked a small distance to the stream and jumped in. The cold water was refreshingly brisk, but but he swam about a bit to stop himself from catching a cold. Seeing him wash, Tayuya grumbled again. However, she admitted to herself that water did look good, and she probably could do with a wash anyway. As she walked over, pulling off her top, she kept telling herself that this was for her, that she wasn't doing this because Naruto had asked her. She jumped in a little further upstream from him and nearly let out another scream of obscenities when she felt just how cold the water was. After a while, though, her body got used to it, and she swam around a little, making sure to go under every so often and clean her hair. She was surprised by how clean and clear the water was this far into a forest. She expected it to be muddy and full of leaves, but she could actually see the bottom. She was startled when she heard Naruto get out of the river and walk over to where the food was cooking. He pulled the towel out of his pack and was about to start wiping himself down when he thought better of it. When Tayuya also got out and joined him, he offered it to her. "What are you doing?" He shrugged but kept the towel in his outstretched hand. "I don't mind drip drying. Plus, if you go to sleep with wet hair, you might catch a cold." She was startled by the show of concern of her well-being, but managed to hide it from her face. Instead, she begrudgingly took the towel, offering a half-mumbled thanks before dropping down next to him. The fire had died down a bit, so Naruto added some wood. The extra warmth was comforting to the two 7-year-olds. They ate in silence, and after they were both fed and dry, Naruto offered an unreturned good night before rolling over in his blanket and closing his eyes. After a few minutes, Tayuya could tell from his steady breathing that he was asleep and tried to do the same. Unfortunately, Tayuya wasn't used to the cold air with only a blanket for warmth. She lacked Naruto's upbringing where even a cardboard box was shelter against the cold nights. As much as she tossed and turned, she just couldn't get to sleep. It didn't help that after a few minutes sunlight began to stream through the trees. She looked over to where Naruto was peacefully sleeping away, completely unaware of her annoyance, and suddenly his offer flashed through her mind. Once again she was overcome with indignation. She would not resort to that, being reliant on somebody just to get her through the night. However, as the minutes trickled by and she got no closer to sleep, her resolve began to waver. He did not look warm right now, and she would practically give anything to get some sleep. She had tried not to show it before, but she was absolutely exhausted, having spent both the day and night awake with only a brief hour-long sleep in the hotel room. Even that didn't help her. As much as she lay there with her eyes closed, sleep just wouldn't take hold. Eventually, she had to get up with no small amount of cursing and walk slowly over to where Naruto was sleeping. She narrowed her eyes and gritted her teeth before lifting up one side of his blanket. Naruto furrowed his brow at the sudden loss of heat, but his features settled into a soft smile when he felt a new source enter his temporary body. Subconsciously, his hand reached out and wrapped around the new source of warmth. pulling it closer. He may have been used to sleeping in the cold, but that but that is just what it was, cold, and any warmth was welcomed. Tayuya let out a gasp when she felt Naruto's arm wrap around her. She was ready to turn around and slam him in the face, but when he muttered something incoherent, she realized he was still asleep and her shoulders sagged. She would never admit it, but with his arm wrapped around her stomach, she felt weird, protected, and safe almost. She knew it was stupid. If they ever really got into any trouble, then there wouldn't be much he could do to her to help. But that was the thought she was left with as sleep finally got to her. Naruto had woken up in a lot of different situations before, soaking wet in the tattered ruins of a cardboard box, hanging upside down tied to a tree, half dead in the middle of a busy street, even being slowly buried in a large hole. However, of all of them, and for those in the near future, he would remember waking up next to Tayuya with the gentle sense of apple and cinnamon in his nose, the strangest if he had anything to compare it to. It would be the time a dog had wandered into the alley he had been sleeping in and nestled down next to him. He always will remember that night with fondness. The dog had obviously been astray, and he had taken comfort in being with something just as outcast as him. Waking up with the body heat of another living creature was a rare occurrence for Naruto, and on that morning, just like now, he savored every second of it. It actually took him a few moments to realize he had his arm wrapped around the sleeping girl, and a part of him didn't want to let go. It was a comfortable position, and if the gentle, steady breaths of Tadiya were anything to go on, then she didn't mind either. However, after some not so gentle insistence from QB, he regretfully slid away from her. He got dressed after another dip in the river and a small breakfast. He had learned his lesson from their first day of training. He had eaten a rather large breakfast, being the bottomless stomach that he was, and had been sick after about an hour of the intense workout. After that, he had limited himself to a much smaller portion of food, which had the benefit of leaving him much hungrier for lunch. That also worked out for the better as it gave him more energy for the chakra exercises, which wouldn't lead to him evacuating his stomach. He made a mental note that he would have to catch more food now that he had someone else to feed before going about his morning exercises with the usual vigor. It was 30 seconds after Tayuya woke up that she realized that there was something wrong. She couldn't quite place it at first as she lay under the blankets. It was dark out, but that wasn't all that unusual. She was in the middle of a forest. Again, weird, but not all that unusual. It just couldn't click, so she tried to roll back over and go back to sleep. Of course, that was when it struck her. She was smiling. It wasn't right. She never smiled. She quickly shot up out of the bed and forced her face back into her usual semi-scowl. Yesterday's events flooded back into her sleep-addled mind, and she hurriedly looked around her, expecting Naruto's sleeping form to be next to her. With an embarrassed blush, she noticed that he wasn't there. That meant that he had woken up and seen her asleep next to him. With a scowl, she wondered why he had left her all alone, seemingly in the middle of the night. However, she brought the blanket closer to her when she wondered if he really had just left her. With a relieved sigh, she noticed that the fire was going and there was some food in the pot, obviously for her. Naruto's pack was also still there, although none of this answered her question as to where he had actually gone. As if the universe had heard her thoughts, she heard a grunt from somewhere away from the clearing. She stood up and was about to follow the sound when she actually took notice of her state of undress. She was about to put her shirt back on, but when she looked at it, she grimaced. The once white shirt was caked with dirt and mud, staining it forever a disgusting brown. She hadn't realized just how dire it had gotten because she hadn't taken it off for so long. She realized with a wince that Naruto's supposedly heightened nose must have had trouble just being around her wearing this thing. She sighed and threw it back down onto the floor. He had been nice enough to do all this for her. The least she could do was try and not make him throw up. She noticed one of Naruto's remarkably cleaner shirts sticking out from the top of his pack, and she threw it on. She didn't think he would mind. She didn't even have to wear pants with it. It acted like a skirt, not that she was the type to wear skirts. Naruto was hardly a tall kid, although that had been improving recently with his better diet. But she was even shorter than he was, and the shirt was already too big for him. Clothed, she finally followed the sounds to its source. It was a clearing not unlike the one they had slept in, but smaller and without the stream. The grunting was coming from Naruto, who seemed to be in the middle of what looked like exercises. Although this wouldn't have usually interested Taiya, it was the fact that he was currently doing a handstand on 3 fingers from each hand, slowly pressing his body closer to the floor before bringing it back up with a grunt. She watched amazed as he continued this, not even noticing the fact that his strained grunts were actually numbers. She only took note of this when, on his last one, he pushed off a bit more vigorously, triumphantly calling out 150 with a satisfied smile. Immediately, Toyuya was disbelieving. There was no way the scrawny kid had managed to do 150 press-ups. She figured he had seen her watching and was just boasting. However, after that, he just seemed to move on to his next exercise, making no motion that he had even seen her. This time, she got to watch through the entire thing as he miraculously performed 200 sit-ups whilst dangling from a tree. When he dropped down, he had the same satisfied grin, but it didn't look cocky, just happy. He again made no move to show that he had seen her, but he called out into the clearing, seemingly at random. I know you're there, Taiya. You can come out. Taiya just did a double take, but walked out into the clearing anyway, where a sweaty and tired looking Naruto finally turned around to face her. How did you know I was there? He smiled sheepishly. I could smell you. Her brow furrowed for a moment. But how did you know it was me? His smile only widened. It's easy to tell apart different scents after a while. I knew it was you because I already smelled you. You smell of cinnamon and apples. He looked at her for a moment, wearing his t-shirt that acted like a dress. Although you did throw me off for a while by wearing my t-shirt. I didn't catch you until I started the sit-ups, and that was only because I moved. Toya tried not to look odd, but it was incredible. At least she didn't doubt his heightened senses anymore. With a small cringe, she realized she hadn't taken a bath this morning. However, he seemed to sense her concerns and smiled. Don't worry about it. All I can smell right now is my own sweat. Taiya just nodded. She didn't need a super sense of smell to practically feel the aroma coming from Naruto. What are you doing out here? Naruto frowned. He would have thought it was obvious. Training, he said as if Taiya should have just known. It was the first time he had even shown a hint of condensation. Taiya's annoyance was overcome by her curiosity. For what? Naruto's smile returned. He was onto a topic he enjoyed now. I'm a shinobi in training. I have to be as physically fit as I can. Taiya looked at him curiously. She had heard of the ninja. You would be hard pressed to find somebody in the elemental nations that hadn't. However, she wouldn't have thought that they started at that at such a young age. Why would you want to be a ninja? Naruto looked at her shocked. This new range of emotions he was giving off was becoming a bit much for Tayuya. Why wouldn't I? It's my dream to become a powerful shinobi and protect the people I care about. Once again, Tayuya was intrigued. What people? I thought you said you had to leave your home. Who's worth protecting if you can't stay there anymore? Naruto's smile vanished immediately, replaced by a saddened look that once again allowed his mask to slip, however briefly. Taya knew she had hit that same sore spot as before and immediately tried to change the subject. She may not have liked people, but she wasn't a sadist. She didn't enjoy watching people suffer, which Naruto obviously was. There was only there was also just something about him, something disarming that made her not want to see him hurt, in the same way that she knew he didn't want to see anybody else hurt. Why don't you tell me about being a ninja? Thankfully for the distraction, Naruto slipped his mask back into place and a broad beaming smile lit up his face. Well, the most important thing to a shinobi is their chakra. Taiya looked at him confusingly. What's chakra? Naruto's grin only grew. In his mind, he was already thinking, just call me Uzumaki-sensei. End of chapter 5.